Hey all, and welcome to the next part of my summer ranking series. This week we'll be going through my top 40 2025 receiver watch list, aka my summer receiver rankings. I mentioned in my last video that I thought it would be a bit until I got this out, but I had some more time than I expected, and some of my summer scouting from last year and in-season watching made it a bit more feasible than expected. Receiver is always a deep position for the draft, so I wanted to include 40. That being said, I'm sure there's some that I missed, so let me know if there's any others you'd recommend that I check out. A couple of other things I want to point out before we get started. Just like the quarterback and running back rankings, these are not as in-depth as my player profiles and evals during the draft season, but more of a quick summary of the players after a rewatch. Also, I'm still having trouble getting chapters to work with the videos, so if you want to jump around to see specific players, I have them all timestamped in the description to make it easier to jump around the video. Also, if you want to check out my quarterback and running back rankings videos, you can find the links in them in the description. With all the receivers we need to go through, let's get these rankings started. Kicking things off at number 40, we have LaJohntay Wester out of Colorado. He's listed on ESPN at 5'11", 167 pounds, and he'll be 23 years and 1 month old on draft night in 2025. He's a fifth-year senior who was at Florida Atlantic for the past 4 seasons and then transferred to Colorado for the 2024 season. For his strengths, Wester has ultra-quick feet that he uses to freeze defenders in the open field and burst past them. He also does a good job using his quick feet to make last-second adjustments with oncoming defenders to lessen the blows they're giving. For his smaller size, I was pretty surprised how consistently Wester won leverage against his corner. He sometimes was hanging on for dear life, but he more times than not did a good job establishing leverage to make an easier throw for his quarterback with his frame. From what I saw, it seemed like Wester also has a good eye for openings against zone coverage. With his size likely limiting him to the slot, it'll be important that he continues to have a good eye against zone to get quick, easy wins. For improvements, with Wester's frame, he has a pretty limited catch radius, and I think that it's smaller than his size indicates since I really don't think he's 5'11". He also sometimes makes things harder for himself by not always catching the ball away from his body, further reducing his catch radius. When Wester does catch the ball away from his body, his hand technique can be a bit inconsistent and his hand strength isn't always there. These issues led to a number of drops for him that appeared in bunches in some games. Also, I'd like to see Wester run a more diverse route tree at Colorado this coming season. He ran a pretty high number of short patterns with about 65% of his receptions being less than 10 yards from the line of scrimmage, so I'd really like to see him expand past the sticks more frequently. In conclusion, Wester is a quick athlete, but I'm not certain if he has enough to his game to be dependable against better athletes, especially if he's smaller than I think like he is. I think he could become a decent gadget player, but I'm not confident in him being more than this right now. Next, number 39, we have Barion Brown out of Kentucky. He's listed on ESPN at 6'1", 166 pounds, and he'll be 21 years and 4 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who's been at Kentucky for the past 2 seasons. For his strengths, Brown's athleticism is his greatest strength with great speed, quickness, and explosiveness. He relies too much on his athleticism right now, but his speed and shiftiness allows him to get yards with the ball in his hands and even let him get some end-around opportunities. Brown also runs the ball with good vision and does a good job following his blocks to pick up extra yards. Brown's core strength also shows when he goes for catches as he's able to make some tough adjustments to balls and is able to rise up and go low for poorly placed balls. For improvements, Brown is a really raw route runner right now with some sloppy cuts and a lack of awareness of how to use tempo and fakes to create easier separation. He also often takes himself out of the play by taking himself into coverage with a lack of awareness of zone coverage. Brown also needs to work to make his hands more reliable. He struggled with drops, often using poor hand technique and clap attacks. Also, he often resorted to catching the ball against his body instead of reaching out to snatch the ball, which limited him in contested catch situations. Brown also has a very lean frame at 6'1", 166 pounds, and his leaner build shows in his routes where he can be knocked around a bit and can be easily redirected by more physical defenders. Also, his limited contact balance sometimes decreased how dynamic of a player he can be with the ball in his hands. In conclusion, Brown is a very good athlete, but I just don't have confidence in him as a receiver right now. If he can polish his route running or at the very least clean up his hands, I feel more comfortable trusting him and could consider moving him up thanks to his great athleticism. Next, number 38, we have McCoy out of Tennessee. He's listed on ESPN at 6'3", 220 pounds, and he'll be 24 years and 10 months old on draft night in 2025. Get ready because this backstory is a long one. He's a redshirt fifth-year senior who started out his career at USC, but after 17 days transferred to Texas due to Cliff Kingsbury leaving the team to be the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. Then McCoy transferred back to USC after spring practice of Texas, then missed the 2019 season due to unspecified symptoms. Then he played the 2020 season with USC, but then was suspended for the 2021 season for a domestic violence investigation, and while he was never received any charges, USC didn't reinstate him, so he transferred to Tennessee for the 2022 season, where he played the 2022 season behind Jaylin Hyatt and Cedric Tillman, but then missed the majority of the 2023 season due to displaced fracture of his right ankle early in the season. Phew, okay, now to strengths. For strengths, McCoy has massive hands and can golf a football. He does a good job attacking the ball in the air and uses good hand technique to be a reliable receiver. McCoy also brings a lot of physicality you don't often see at the position. He isn't afraid to lower his shoulder into a defender and does a good job standing his ground against press. He also isn't shy about driving through contact to rise up and make a play on the ball. McCoy hasn't gotten a lot of opportunity to show it, but he has shown some good glimpses of ball tracking, being capable of tracking throws downfield and through defenders' arms. For improvements, while McCoy can make catches through contact, he sometimes has to do this due to struggles creating separation. It could be due to his injury history, but he didn't look overly explosive to his cuts and overall didn't seem to have great speed to create consistent separation. McCoy's lack of playing time also hasn't allowed him to develop his route running. His route tree looked limited, and his cuts looked choppy, needing extra steps to execute them, and as I mentioned before, often not having the explosiveness needed to create quick separation. Also, nothing that McCoy can change now, but as his intro suggested, he has a long pass between injuries and investigations. I think all that could take him off of a lot of teams' draft boards, or at the very least drop him very far on their boards. In conclusion, McCoy unfortunately is in a sticky situation with his age only making things worse. He looks like less of an explosive athlete as injuries rack up and as more time goes on, and he hasn't gotten the time and playing time to be able to develop as a receiver. If he continues to struggle with his development or gets injured again, it's just hard to see him getting a real shot in an NFL roster. Next, number 37, we have Caullin Lacy out of Louisville. He's listed on ESPN at 5'10", 190 pounds, and he'll be 23 years and 4 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a fifth-year senior who began his career at South Alabama and then transferred to Louisville for the 2024 season. For strengths, Lacy has great speed and acceleration, which makes him electric against lower competition. There are so many games when he looked like the best athlete on the field while playing with South Alabama. That likely won't continue at Louisville, but his athleticism should be apparent when he gets the ball. Lacy's athleticism easily translates to his yak ability, allowing him to speed past defenders. He's also pretty slippery for his size and does a good job altering his speed to disrupt the pursuit angles and then rip past defenders. His shiftiness also lets him juke out a lot of defenders at times. Something that was a nice surprise for me was seeing how good of an eye Lacy had for openings against zone coverage. He ran a lot of shallow crosses and seemed to have a good understanding of when to settle down and get his body ready to get the ball from his quarterback. For improvements, Lacy needs to adjust to the physicality of route running. He struggles in his ability to maintain his balance and path in his routes, and there are too many times when the defenders would get their hands on him and either severely slow him down or force him far off his path. This issue may have also continued into his release, as the team typically hit him from press either by using him from the slot or moving him with motion. These struggles appeared against lower competition, and I have concerns that they'll become even worse as his level of competition rises at Louisville and then the NFL. I'd also like to see Lacy catch the ball away from his body more consistently. He doesn't have the biggest frame, so this could help him finish more catches, but would also give him more time to gather and secure the ball to turn and become the electric player he is in the open field. Something that had more to do with the offense than Lacy's skill was his low ADOT. If you didn't see my charting and scouting report for Carter Bradley, South Alabama's offense had an emphasis on the short passing game, which affected all the receivers. Lacy's ADOT isn't as low as some of the other receivers in this group, but is an area I'm hoping improves with the change to Louisville. In conclusion, Lacy got a lot of his production after a catch thanks to athleticism, but I'm worried that if he starts to face better and better athletes, that production is going to dip. His athleticism could translate to some quality route running, but he'll need to start to show signs of a better route runner to have a chance in the NFL with his frame and balance. Next, number 36, we have Jerand Bradley out of Boston College. He's listed on ESPN at 6'5", 220 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 6 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt junior who was at Texas Tech for the past 3 seasons, but transferred to Boston College for the 2024 season. For his strengths, Bradley can definitely get too physical at times with his release, but does a good job using his long arms to create space for himself. He can work to get out of his stance a bit lower to minimize the surface area that corners can press, but in general he gives himself a good chance with his release. Bradley also catches the ball with strong, aggressive hands. He does a good job snatching the ball in the air at its highest point and making the most of his long wingspan. He also has very tough hands to finish catches in tight quarters and makes him an interesting red zone threat. Bradley also has really solid ball tracking to make him a solid deep option. He does a good job tracking the ball over his shoulders and also can follow off-target throws and make adjustments to make attempts at the ball. For improvements, Bradley has to find a way to get more consistent separation. Right now, he doesn't have the quickness or route running technique to get consistent separation, and often needs to rely on his size to win, which will be less of a viable option in the NFL. Speaking of route running, Bradley needs to work on running quicker, more effective routes. He often takes too much time to get into his routes, which could maybe be passable if he had more explosiveness to his cuts, but it often just delays the process, and he still has weak cuts that give him little separation. Also, there were a number of plays where Bradley seemed a little bit slow to react and didn't, or maybe even just didn't give his best effort. People may say that this is primarily an effort thing, but it came off more as a focus thing for me, as there were times when he'd be too slow to react to a corner he needed to block, or he didn't make a good counter to a corner that was covering him. In conclusion, Bradley has interesting traits that are more interesting thanks to some potential with his release, but he's still a big project right now. If he can find a way to create consistent separation and be a more reliable route runner, he could become a more exciting prospect. Right now, he's more or less going to need to continue to be reliant on his size if he doesn't improve for the upcoming season. Next, number 35, we have Elijah Sarratt out of Indiana. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 190 pounds, and he'll be 20 years and 11 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who started his career at St. Francis, and then transferred to James Madison for the 2023 season, and now transferred to Indiana for the 2024 season. For strengths, Sarratt has extremely tough hands with only 2 career drops on 164 targets, and converting on 70% of his contested catch situations. He does a good job extending for the ball and consistently catching the ball with good hand technique. Also, I was pretty impressed with Sarratt's release skills. He didn't have the most diverse amount of ways to beat press and isn't the quickest, but has good timing with his approach and does a good job keeping himself clean and working his way past the corner to get out on his route. While Sarratt isn't going to be a big contributor in yak situations, he does have good vision that adds appeal to him when he has the ball in his hands. He does a good job following his blocks and seems to have good peripheral vision to adjust his path with defenders closing in. For improvements, I have concerns with Sarratt's ability to separate against better competition. As I mentioned, he isn't the quickest or fastest player, so there are a number of times when corners could stick with him in his pocket. What could really help Sarratt separate more consistently is improving as a route runner. Right now he runs routes at one speed and his cuts are very rounded and lack the sharpness needed to create consistent separation against better coverage. I also have some concerns with Sarratt's ability to get consistent leverage. Sometimes he will establish it early from the start of his routes, but other times, especially when the defender is starting downfield, he can really struggle to get leverage against his defender and make it harder for his quarterback to fit a throw in. In conclusion, Sarratt is a decent player with great hands, but is still really raw, and I'm not certain he's capable of separating consistently against better athletes. However, he's still young and has a chance to prove himself in another new situation as he continues to transfer up to a higher level of competition. Next, number 34, we have Squirrel White out of Tennessee. He's listed on ESPN at 5'10", 165 pounds, and he'll be 20 years and 11 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who's been at Tennessee for the past 2 seasons. For strengths, White is a great athlete with great speed and acceleration, which let him speed past defenders for immediate yards when he finds an opening in the defense or when used in the screen game. White also has super quick feet, which give him potential as a route runner. Right now, he mostly uses his feet to good use with the ball in his hands to make defenders miss, but he can also sometimes use that quickness to shake defenders on short routes. White has a limited catch radius with his size, but he does everything he can to try to extend it. I regularly saw him diving to the ground for balls and leaping up to try to get his hands on balls above his head. It didn't always lead to great results, but the effort was good to see. There were even some moments when he showed good foot awareness around the sidelines, and along with his adjustment skills, he also showed some solid ball tracking skills that showed that he was even able to finish some catches over his shoulders. For improvements, White really needs to clean up his route running and expand his route tree as it looked extremely limited. He knows he's fast and just tries to rush through a lot of his routes, but this causes him to not have clean breaks or tempo into his routes that allow him to be more effective. I also would like to see him have more of an awareness of openings against zone coverage, as he tends to drift towards defenders with not much awareness for his surroundings. Right now, he's kind of just running routes like an athlete, but needs to run them more like a receiver. White also doesn't catch the ball with good hand technique on a routine basis, which contributed to a number of his drops. He also often relies on body catches instead of making catches with his hands, which delays him in breaking upfield and also contributed to some of those drops. I also just have a serious question of if White can play outside with his size and frame. Tennessee hasn't seemed very confident in his ability to play outside with only 25 career snaps on the outside. With his size and frame, I have serious questions about how he can handle press in the NFL, and his few reps against press or physical coverage haven't been encouraging. He could earn his way into a slot role in the NFL, but that positional limitation will likely hamper his draft outlook. In conclusion, White feels too much like an athlete trying to play receiver right now. There are some aspects that get my interest, like his adjustment skills, ball tracking, and athleticism, but overall he just doesn't seem to have a firm handle on how to run routes, and his size may be too limiting to be that impactful of a player in the NFL. Next, number 33, we have Colbie Young out of Georgia. He's listed on ESPN at 6'3", 215 pounds, and will be 21 years and 9 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a senior who began his college career at Lackawanna College, then transferred to Miami for his sophomore year, and now transferred to Georgia for his senior season. For his strengths, Young has very good hands that are both reliable and violent. He does a really good job high-pointing the ball and isn't afraid to go up and attack the ball at its highest point. With his struggles getting consistent separation, it's vital that he continues to attack the ball the way that he does. Young also got a lot more opportunities to play on the line as the X this past season and continued to show good release skills. He has good patience and focus in his release and has a variety of moves to win with stutter steps and jab steps to get past the corner. Young also has some nice tools to become a possible red zone weapon for a team. He has good size, release skills, hands, and jumping ability to win quickly in close quarters and win 50-50 opportunities. For improvements, Young still looks very unpolished as a route runner. He's too upright in his breaks, which forces him to need several extra steps to make his cuts. Also, he doesn't seem to run his routes with much, if any, rhythm, and also seem to be running a relatively limited route tree from what I could tell. Also, Young has good jumping athleticism, but I include athleticism in his areas of improvements due to him seeming to be a slow accelerator and lacking good long speed. His lack of good acceleration and speed really limited him as a downfield threat. Also, with the combination of his unpolished route running, he really struggles to get consistent separation. He gets some initial separation thanks to his release skills, but defenders often are able to close that gap. In conclusion, right now Young looks best as a jump ball specialist and a do-it-all receiver. That's helpful if you need that type of receiver or have a role for that type of receiver in your offense, but if a team doesn't have a quarterback that is capable of delivering those throws, he kind of starts to be less effective for your team. Hopefully he can show that he is a bit more versatile this coming season. Next, number 32, we have Brennan Presley out of Oklahoma State. He's listed on ESPN at 5'8", 175 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 2 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a fifth-year senior who's been at Oklahoma State for the past 4 seasons. For strengths, Presley is at his best when given opportunity to run behind blockers. He has great vision with great start-stop ability with good acceleration. He also has good timing with his cuts to make defenders miss with his shiftiness. Presley definitely benefits from easier catches attempts being so close to the line of scrimmage, but he has reliable hands and does a good job consistently catching the ball away from his body. Catching away from his body also gives him more time to get himself set and explode downfield on screen plays. Also, Presley showed good awareness for openings against zone coverage and does a good job using his quickness to win off the line, but then can hit the brakes when he's in a soft spot against the defense. For improvements, if you saw my summer rankings last year, you would have seen that I had Jacob Cowling higher than consensus. Cowling did eventually drop in my final rankings during the draft cycle and slid to the final pick of the 4th round of the draft, in part due to his role decreasing at Arizona and seeing his ADOT drop every year. And I have concerns with Presley since we're seeing some of the same trends with him having about 75% of his targets coming from less than 10 yards from the line of scrimmage, and a little less than a third coming from behind the line of scrimmage. On top of Presley's low ADOT, he's also exclusively almost a full-time slot player, and will likely remain this way in the NFL with his frame. If you combine his frame, position limitations, and potential utilization limitations, it becomes hard to justify a team targeting him over other options. Also, Presley does show flashes of good route running, but his route tree is extremely limited right now. He could handle other routes, but he just needs to show it to prove it. In conclusion, if a team wants to take Presley to primarily use him as a gadget player, I think they'll be very happy with the return. If they expect a more diverse receiver, I'm not confident he can follow through on this, but hopefully he'll progress instead of continuing to regress in his role this coming season. Next, number 31, we have Kydren Lacy out of LSU. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 215 pounds, and he'll be 24 years and 4 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a fifth-year senior who played his first 2 seasons at Louisiana, then transferred to LSU for the 2022 season. For strengths, I was pretty impressed with Lacy's route running. He can definitely work to make sharper cuts, but he seemed to have a good understanding of how to use tempo and fakes to get the corner's hips turned and break to his intended path. He also seemed to run a pretty diverse route tree, which should translate to the NFL. It doesn't completely show in Lacy's contested catch numbers, but Lacy catches the ball with very tough hands and isn't afraid to do the dirty work in the middle of the field and take hits to finish catches. That grit will stand out to teams and could give him a chance to make an NFL roster. I was also impressed with the way Lacy is able to adjust to misplaced throws. He could maximize this skill by catching the ball away from his body more consistently, which we'll get into later, but he does a good job tracking the ball and finishing some tough catches. For improvements, I like to see Lacy play with better awareness against zone coverage given the number of years he's been in college. There were a lot of times when he would get open with his route against the coverage, but continued his route and took himself to a defender and made himself covered. I would also like to see Lacy catch the ball away from his body more consistently. He has decently reliable hands, but he was often too willing to catch the ball away into his body and trap it against himself. With his size and long arms, I'd really like to see him take advantage of that and to make more plays attacking the ball. I also have questions about how athletic Lacy is. He's a solid athlete, but he doesn't seem to have the great explosiveness to create immediate separation and doesn't have the long speed to separate downfield. In conclusion, Lacy is a gritty player with a bit of route running and body adjustment upside, but overall lacks the athleticism and doesn't snatch the ball routinely enough to make me really excited. He's likely an undrafted free agent player right now, but he could be one that gets a chance to add some playing time down the road thanks to his grit and effort. Next, number 30, we have Dane out of Kentucky. He's listed on ESPN at 6'3", 195 pounds. He'll be 21 years and 9 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who's been at Kentucky for the past 2 seasons. For strengths, I was pleasantly surprised by Key's route running. He does a really nice job breaking down despite his lankier build and is capable of making pretty efficient cuts in his breaks. He does a good job using head fakes and leg drives to get corners' hips open to cut towards the other side for quick separation. Key also seemed to have a good eye for openings against zone coverage and typically knew where to settle to make himself an easy target. His awareness also carried over to scramble drills, where he would often find openings against the defense to make himself a viable target for the quarterback. Also, Key shows the ability to use the most of his long frame to attack the ball and can contort his body for back shoulder and misplaced throws. He doesn't explode towards the ball, but he does have good timing with his attacks and good acrobatic ability to ensure he remains in bounds. For improvements, Key's hands took a bit of a step backward this year with an increased number of drops. He does a good job attacking the ball and catching away from his body, like I mentioned, but he had a number of times when he misjudged the ball and attacked the ball with suboptimal hand technique that led to those drops. Also, from a technical standpoint, Key's release isn't that bad. The problem is that he really lacks explosiveness and smooth movement skills that a lot of other receivers have that lead him to not to be able to generate that immediate separation at the start of his route. At times, he can find himself getting his route cut off by a defender, or a defender getting right on top of him due to this. On that note of lacking explosiveness, it just doesn't seem like Key is that great of an athlete, lacking great straight line speed and quickness needed to be really good at the position. He has some nice size and technical skills to give him a chance at an NFL roster, but I just don't know how effective he will be in the NFL with his athleticism. In conclusion, he is a solid player who could become a receiver 4, maybe a receiver 3 if he's fortunate thanks to his size and technical skills as a route runner. I don't think he'll be a major contributor due to his lack of athleticism, but he seems like he's capable of being a solid contributor if his hands return to his 2021 form. Next, number 29, we have Sheppard out of Colorado. He's listed on ESPN at 6'3", 198 pounds, and he'll be 23 years and 2 months old on draft night in 2025 from what I could find. He's a fifth-year senior who began his career at Vanderbilt, but transferred to Colorado for the 2024 season. For strengths, Sheppard does a good job attacking the ball using the most of his taller frame to leap up and get the ball. He also showed the ability to adjust to poorly thrown balls and make plays on balls that could have been interceptions if he hadn't made a play on them. He doesn't always finish the catch, but he's doing a lot of the hard parts, so hopefully finishing these catches come to him this coming season. Also, I wouldn't consider route running a major strength for Sheppard, but he does have some nice tools. He usually needs a few extra steps, but he can make some crisp cuts with some decent explosiveness in them. Also, he has some nice head fakes and jab steps that he throws in at times to get defenders biting. Sheppard also has a really good blend of speed, quickness, and size. This shined when he had the ball in his hands and was given open space to run. Also, he didn't always have a quarterback who could consistently get him the ball downfield, but there is potential there. For improvements, Sheppard really needs to clean up his hands as he had way too many drops and, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't always finish tough catches that he gets his hands on. If he cleans up his hands, he would immediately make himself a more interesting prospect. Sheppard also needs to work on his release. He does a good job keeping his balance, but often doesn't have much of a plan and often tries to take wide routes to try to avoid the press and ultimately ruins the timing of plays and takes himself out of them. I mentioned this last summer, and still have the same issue with Sheppard, which is that he needs to become a more consistent player in all facets. With his hands, route running, and releases, it all needs to come together for him to be a more productive player against better competition on a regular basis. In conclusion, if you watch Sheppard's highlights, this probably feels way too low for him. Unfortunately, the snaps in between are less inspiring. If he can learn to become a more consistent player and not stack a lot of his production against lesser competition, he could start to finally deliver on his potential. Next, number 28, we have Jeremiah Hunter out of Washington. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 200 pounds, and he'll be 22 years old on draft night 2025. He's a young redshirt senior who was at Cal for his first 4 seasons, and now transferred to Washington for the 2024 season. For strengths, Hunter's hands are glue and might be up there with some of the best hands in this group. He has a wide catch radius and does a good job attacking the ball with good hand technique. When he gets his hands on the ball, it's usually game over, as he's more often than not will come down with it, even with a defender around him. Hunter also has a variety of moves to win against press. He has quick enough feet with really good timing and anticipation to help him get past corners. He also does a good job extending his arms to create separation against quicker, smaller receivers who are able to keep up with him. As I mentioned, Hunter has a good catch radius thanks to his frame, but also thanks to his ability to rise up and go low for balls. He isn't quite capable of being a red zone monster just yet, but he does have the movement skills to help bail out quarterbacks or come through on 50-50 throws. He also knows how to use his body to box out defenders and make a clean play on the ball. For improvements, Hunter just doesn't have great athleticism and doesn't have much to offer with the ball in his hands. It's one thing if a receiver is lacking speed like Hunter is, but he also lacks explosiveness and quickness, which makes it really hard to see him being more effective in the NFL. With Hunter's limited athleticism, he really struggles to get consistent separation. There's so many times when Hunter would have a good release, but the corner was still able to mirror his movements. I just really have a hard time believing that he's suddenly going to be able to separate more consistently in the NFL after struggling so much in college with separation. For the routes Hunter ran, he ran them very effectively with his athleticism. The problem is that he seemed to have a very limited route tree primarily made up of hitches, slants, posts, and go routes. There wasn't too much diversity in his route tree, and he'll need to be able to prove that he can effectively run every route if he wants to roll in an offense in the NFL. In conclusion, I want to like Hunter more since his hands are great and can be a great asset with his size, but I just can't get past his struggles with separation, and I just don't feel like this is going to get better anytime soon. His high-end projection for me is Josh Palmer, who I really like. However, Hunter is going to need to prove that he can run a full route tree of Washington to be able to earn a role as a receiver 3 for an NFL team down the road like Palmer was. Next, number 27, we have Theo Wease Jr. out of Missouri. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 192 pounds. He'll be 23 years and 10 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt junior who started out his career at Oklahoma, then transferred to Missouri for the 2023 season. For strengths, Wease Jr. has really sticky hands and routinely catches the ball with good hand technique. He does a really good job catching the ball away from his frame and has good, strong hands to finish catches through hits. He also does a good job going up and down low for balls for slightly off-target throws. Wease Jr. is also a quality route runner who makes concise cuts and shows a good understanding of how and when to use fakes in his routes. He also has a good eye for openings against zone coverage and routinely did a good job slowing down his routes to be an easy target for his quarterback. Wease Jr. also has really good release skills and knows how to beat a corner regardless of whether they're aligned to take the inside or outside away, and knows how to keep himself clean against press. He also does a good job consistently winning despite going against better, quicker athletes. For improvements, as I mentioned though, Wease Jr. isn't an overly dynamic athlete. He is a bit sluggish in his breaks and is a slow accelerator. Plus the issue is his full speed just doesn't seem that great, so he isn't able to ride that much with the ball in his hands. Where Wease Jr.'s athleticism also caused issues is in his separation. There were a lot of times when he would get a good release and ran a good route, but just wasn't able to get that much separation since the quicker, faster defender caught up to him. With this happening in college, it's likely going to continue and get worse in the NFL. While Wease Jr. is good at finishing catches through contact when he gets his hands on the ball, he doesn't seem to always have the vertical strength to rise up and attack the ball in the air through defenders. With his size, it would be a nice asset to add to his game and would add another dimension to how he can help a team. In conclusion, Wease Jr. is a solid player, but I feel like it's going to be hard for him to contribute too much in the NFL. His hands, route running, and release are all really solid, and I like Hunter, but like Hunter, I think that his limited athleticism will be too much overcome. However, if he can continue to keep taking steps forward as a route runner, he could find a role as a quality reserve receiver for a team. Next, number 26, we have Nick Anderson out of Oklahoma. He's listed on ESPN at 6'4", 209 pounds, and he'll be 21 years and 1 month old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt sophomore who's been at Oklahoma for the past 2 seasons. For strengths, Nick Anderson's ball tracking was very impressive, showing the ability to effortlessly finish catches over his shoulder. He also used his ball tracking skills to adjust to throws off his frame and add a bit more to his game than just being a vertical weapon. Also, Anderson's athleticism shows in basically every play he's in on. In most plays, he's flying downfield on a vertical route and is creating a lot of natural separation thanks to his speed and acceleration. His size also lets him stack corners consistently, making himself a strong vertical weapon. I was also pretty impressed with Anderson's release. It's nothing special, but he has a pretty good understanding of how to use just a little bit of tempo to keep the defenders off balance and when to turn on the jets to beat them downfield. For improvements, Anderson needs to work on having more consistent hands. He didn't have very many targets, but still had 6 drops last year. At times he can have a bit of a clap attack in his approach to balls when he catches with his hands, and sometimes has a tendency to trap the ball with his body, which worsens his ability to finish catches through hits. Also, Anderson's route running is really raw and pretty undeveloped right now. He has a really limited route tree that is primarily vertical, post, and hitches routes, and while he can do well in those routes thanks to his vertical ability, he needs to show more versatility and cleaner cuts to be able to be more of a versatile weapon. While Anderson has great speed and acceleration, I was a bit disappointed with how stiff he looked when he got the ball in space. He had a really tough time adjusting to defenders and making plays in the open field, and didn't seem like he had much of a spark to make defenders miss. In conclusion, Anderson is clearly a very potent vertical weapon and could be a good fit for a team that likes to air it out. My concern is if he can offer anything outside of vertical routes. Being limited to a specific role can be great as it can get a team to target you if they have a specific role they need to be filled. However, if there aren't enough teams looking for the role that you can do well and you can't offer too much outside of that, you likely aren't going to be able to offer much for most teams. Next, number 25, we have Jaylin Noel out of Iowa State. He's listed on ESPN at 5'10", 200 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 7 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a senior who's been at Iowa State for his entire career. For his strengths, Noel is a really clean route runner who can make some clean cuts and is overall efficient in his route running. He also showed a good understanding of using head fakes and tempo in his routes and seemed to have a good eye for openings against zone coverage. While Noel has some drop issues, it isn't due to weak hands. He has strong hands that are able to hold on to the ball through contact and typically does a good job snatching the ball to limit defenders' chance of breaking up the throw. Also, Noel didn't get a chance to show it too often, but he seemed to have a good eye to track the ball. It showed in a lot of his shorter routes while following the ball through defenders, but he also showed a few instances of being able to finish some catches over his shoulder. For improvements, I was hoping Noel would take a step forward with his hands this coming season, but he still had some concentration drops pop up in his game. He catches the ball with good hand technique and typically catches away from his body, but he still has lapses in concentration from time to time that he needs to clean up. Noel also had a lot of success come from being underneath with an 8 out of just 7.7 and about 79% of his receptions coming less than 10 yards from the line of scrimmage. He did do some more work out of the slot this past season, which is encouraging, but I want to see him win more downfield to add more to his game. Noel also just doesn't look like he's a very good athlete. He has decent quickness and average speed, but lacks the explosiveness in his cuts. Also, his lack of dynamic athletic ability shows when he has the ball in his hands and he struggles to make defenders miss. His frame also looks relatively small, which gives him a smaller catch radius despite consistently reaching out for catches. In conclusion, I was hoping Noel would take a step forward last year, but it kind of felt like more of the same other than a few more snaps outside. He has the makings of a decent slot receiver, but I don't think he's that great and needs to clean up his concentration drops to really be able to earn a role in the NFL. Next, number 24, we have Beaux out of Notre Dame. He's listed on ESPN at 6'3", 210 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 4 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a senior who was at Clemson for the first 3 seasons, but transferred to Notre Dame for the 2024 season. For his strengths, Collin's route running is still really solid as he runs with good tempo and good nuance to help him get open underneath. He's also capable of making pretty sharp cuts and seems to run a good variety of routes. Also, Collin's release is still really solid with a good variety of moves to win at the line of scrimmage, and good balance and use of his long arms to help maintain some early separation. He does a good job winning with his quick feet and with some more nuanced, well-timed fakes that make him really hard for corners to keep up with. Collins also showed a really good eye for openings against zone defense. He does a good job making subtle movements away from the defenders and close to the quarterback to make himself an easier target to find and fit a throw into. For improvements, I think the core of my issues with Collins comes from his average athleticism. He isn't a terrible athlete, but he seems to lack some of the quick acceleration, higher end speed that holds him back from being a deep threat in yak situations. On that note of Collin's average athleticism, this also limits his ability to get consistent separation. As I mentioned, he's a good route runner, so you would think he would get open on a routine basis, and while he can't get open underneath, defenders can close the gap downfield since he lacks the acceleration to blow by them and lacks the speed to maintain that distance. Also, Caullin has tough hands to finish catches through contact, but will sometimes have lapses in his approach with hand technique and will sometimes attack the ball with suboptimal technique. It happened enough that it led to a fair number of unnecessary drops for him last year and the year before. In conclusion, I really liked Collin's last year and was hoping he would take a step forward in 2023. And while he did improve statistically, his average athleticism and struggles to separate at the second level make me concerned about how high of a ceiling he truly has. He could operate well as a big slot with his route running, but he's played the X for most of his career at Clemson, so we'll see how Notre Dame decides to use him this coming season. Next, at number 23, we have Rock Taylor out of Memphis. He's listed on ESPN at 6'3", 215 pounds, and he'll be about 22 years old on draft night in 2025 from what I could find. He's a senior who's been at Memphis for the past 3 seasons. For strengths, Taylor's capable of making some really tough adjustments to the ball in the air. At times, he can rise up and look like an acrobat in the air with great extension to the high point of the ball. Also, Taylor's athleticism for his build is really interesting. He has very quick feet for a receiver his size and has good speed and acceleration to create distance between himself and defenders. He also looks smooth with his movements that make him a good yak weapon. Taylor also has very strong hands. A lot of times if he gets his hand on the ball, it's likely going to result in a completion. With his size and athleticism, his reliable hands make him an even more interesting prospect. For improvements, I like to see Taylor get a cleaner release. As I mentioned before, he has quick feet for his size and long arms, but there are still too many times when he would allow a defender to get their hands all over him and slow him down. If he can keep himself clean, it would allow him to make even more big plays. Taylor also needs to add more nuance to his route running. Right now he's relying too much on his athleticism, which can let him win in college, but will be less effective in the NFL against better competition. I really want to see him add some tempo to his routes, make sharper cuts, and add some fakes into his routes to take his game to the next level. When Taylor struggles with his release and route running, it led to disappointing results in his ability to get consistent separation. When I first saw his movement skills, I was excited to see him win past defenders, but there were a lot of times when defenders could keep up with him and limited his production. In conclusion, Taylor has a lot of potential, but needs to refine his release and route running to start to deliver on that potential more consistently. If he makes those adjustments, I could see him rising far up these rankings. Next, number 22, we have Antoine Juice Wells Jr. out of Ole Miss. He's listed on ESPN at 6'1", 208 pounds, and he'll be 24 years old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt senior who missed most of last season due to a foot injury, and he started his career at James Madison, then transferred to South Carolina for the 2022 season, and now transferred to Ole Miss for the 2024 season. For strengths, Wells Jr. is a great athlete with a good combination of speed, strength, and burst. He isn't going to outrun an entire defense, but he's very difficult to bring down and will often make the first defender miss. He also pairs his athleticism with great vision to be a great yak weapon. Wells Jr. also has really strong, reliable hands. He has sure hands and consistently catches the ball away from his body. And while he definitely benefited with his catch numbers thanks to a high number of screens, he consistently showed the ability to catch the ball away from his frame and through hard hits or while defenders were all over him. Wells Jr. also showed some really impressive adjustment skills to balls that were away from his frame with good timing to his attacks. Also, he could contort his body and seem to have good foot awareness around the sidelines. For improvements, it's hard to know if this was going to be better this year, but Wells Jr. had an incredibly simplistic route tree in 2022 that was almost consistently all screens, slants, and go routes, and when he did venture to other routes, he had very rounded and sloppy cuts with little to no nuance to his routes. The team clearly wanted to use his athleticism, but he needs to show that he can win in the technical aspects as a receiver as well as the athletic side. Also, there were a number of times when it seemed that Wells Jr. had a hard time getting a good read on where the ball was and would have awkward attacks at the ball with suboptimal hand technique. He has strong enough hands and strength to overcome those errors, but an area he can grow in to be a more dangerous downfield receiver. With Wells Jr. being moved in motion a lot, he didn't have to face press a lot and would benefit from free releases. He certainly might be able to handle press, but thanks to his size and strength, but it remains to be seen. In conclusion, Wells Jr. is a really promising athlete if he remains healthy for the upcoming season, but a lot of hope and projection for him will come down to the belief if he can develop as a route runner or if he'll be paired with an offensive mind that can make the most of his athleticism. If you like Malachi Corley last draft cycle, you'll probably be a fan of Wells Jr. this next cycle. Personally, I was concerned about Corley's route running, but we'll see how that affects Corley in NFL and how it affects Wells Jr. this coming season. Next, number 21, we have Jeremy Bernard out of Alabama. He's listed on ESPN at 5'11", 208 pounds, and he'll be 21 years and 4 months old on draft night 2025. He started out his career at Michigan State, then transferred to Washington for the 2023 season, and now transferred to Alabama for the 2024 season to stay with DeBoer. For strengths, despite Bernard's limited opportunities, he showed good awareness for openings against zone coverage in short areas of the field and down the field. He does a good job remaining patient and adjusting his speed to get past the initial coverage and then settling into the open area. He also does a good job getting turned to the quarterback and always seemed ready for the pass. Also, Bernard consistently caught the ball away from his body with good hand technique, and though he didn't have a lot of volume given his limited experience, having only one drop on 57 career targets isn't a fluke, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has a similar ratio with his volume going up this coming season. Also, when Bernard has the ball in his hands, he plays bigger than his size with good balance and tenacity to keep his balance and make defenders miss. He also showed good strength and balance in his route running, where he's often able to maintain his balance through his routes, despite defenders trying to steer him off course. For improvements, I wouldn't consider Bernard's route running a major weakness, but definitely an area of improvement. He ran a pretty diverse route tree with his limited experience, but he would often come in too hot into his breaks and either needed additional steps to make clean cuts or ended up just making sloppy rounded cuts. I'd also like to see him use more effective jab steps and head fakes instead of rushing his process. If he can find that balance of good route speed with concise cuts and fakes, this could easily be a strength of his by the end of the coming season. Also, Bernard isn't a terrible athlete, but he seems like a very average athlete. He seems like he's capable of having enough burst to overcome this in his route running, but he'll need to become a better route runner like I previously mentioned to be able to ensure he can get consistent separation. Also, something that Bernard will need to prove with more experience is if he can beat press. Washington often allowed him to avoid press by having Odunze and Polk play outside, and in the few reps I saw Bernard face press or similar coverage to press, he seemed capable of getting past it, but seemed a bit hesitant with his approach. If he can speed up that process and with more experience, this could be a non-issue for him. In conclusion, Bernard is a really interesting player who has a lot of potential to rise if a lot of the question marks are answered with more experience. He could make this low ranking look silly in a year, but I want to see him prove it, and some of my concerns about his athleticism made me keep him at this rank down this low. Alright, halfway there. Next, number 20, we have Trey Harris out of Ole Miss. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 205 pounds, and he'll be 23 years and 2 months old on draft night 2025. He's a fifth-year senior who was at Louisiana Tech for his first 3 seasons, then transferred to Ole Miss for the 2023 season. For strengths, Harris has a very strong and explosive first step that he combines with his size and quickness to get immediate separation from defenders. His laser-fast get-off also helps him make the first move off the line and get his route started off on a good note. Harris's ball tracking also shows up on nearly every target. He does a great job tracking the ball downfield and making some great catches over his shoulders. He also showed the ability to finish tough catches over his shoulders even with the defender all over him. Harris also has great hands and routinely catches the ball with good hand technique. He has very reliable hands and isn't afraid to go up or take on a hit to finish a tough catch. For improvements, Harris can greatly improve as a route runner. It's actually disappointing to watch at times because his release can be really good and can get immediate separation, but then he completely loses that separation as he progresses into his route due to weak and rounded cuts. He also seems to run a limited route tree that's been plaguing Ole Miss receivers under Lane Kiffin, and he also really only seemed to play from the right side of the formation, which Ole Miss has been doing to their receivers, which also limits them in the NFL. It doesn't sound like it should be hard, but translating success from one side of the field to the other isn't always a given without a proper amount of snaps and practice. Circling back to Harris losing his separation, that was also a major issue I had while watching him. Like I mentioned, his speed seemed to decline as the route continued, and so did the gap between him and the corner. There were just too many times when a corner would be right on top of him. Now, credit to him for being able to play through the corner at times, but that just isn't a recipe for success in the NFL. I'd also like to see Harris have more success finishing contested catches. Now, he had a pretty high volume of those opportunities which brought his success rate down, similar to what happened to Keon Coleman last draft cycle, but he has room to improve. He does a great job timing his jumps, but he doesn't always extend his arms to attack the ball or use his body to box the defender out, allowing them to make a play on the ball. If he does a better job using his size against smaller corners, he could really turn into a huge red zone machine. In conclusion, Harris makes me nervous since there's so much buzz potential in the way he wins right now. As it stands now, he's kind of the classic case of a receiver who can feast off of highlight level catches through contact and in contested situations, but really struggles to make his life easier by getting separation with his route running. Players like Harris often get people excited with their highlight plays, but their rate of success in the NFL is very low if they can't be a more balanced player. Next, number 19, we have Xavier Restrepo out of Miami. He's listed on ESPN at 5'10", 198 pounds, and he'll be 23 years old on draft night in 2025. He's a fifth-year senior who's been at Miami for the past 4 seasons and had a breakout year last season. For strength, Restrepo's route running always jumps out on the screen in all of his routes. He does a good job breaking down in his cuts and making sharp, concise cuts. He lacks explosiveness in his cuts, which definitely limit the separation that he can get from his cuts, but his diverse route tree and strong route running fundamentals are really encouraging for a player with a high floor. What also gives Restrepo a high floor and makes him a safe player is his hands. He has very reliable hands and does a good job attacking the ball with good hand technique. He also showed tough hands and good concentration to be reliable when finishing catches through hits, which will be vital if he continues to be a slot-only player. Also, despite having a smaller frame, Restrepo does a good job maximizing it. He does a good job making adjustments to poorly placed balls, and when a ball is within his radius, he's usually coming down with it with his reliable hands. He also showed good foot awareness around the sidelines as well. For improvements, Restrepo seems like a very capable athlete, but not one that is explosive in all of his cuts and with the ball in his hands. He has the tools to get consistent separation, especially when combined with his route running, but his athleticism will likely limit his ceiling. Also, Restrepo didn't have a lot of snaps that he faced press that I could go off of, but the ones that I did watch showed room for improvement. He doesn't do a great job using his quickness to minimize contact, and often lets the defender make the firm initial contact that he just really has a hard time shaking. If he wants to show he can do more on the outside, he'll need to improve how he handles press. On that note, due to his difficulties against press, Restrepo has been a slot receiver for basically his entire college career, and it's more than likely that's where he's going to be limited to in the NFL. That isn't a major issue with the rise of 3 receiver sets, but it does limit his upside and complicates his fit with teams that already have an established slot player. In conclusion, Restrepo is a solid player, but not one that I think has a very high ceiling. I think he has a place on an NFL team and could even be a productive player if he goes to a quarterback that loves to target their slot guy. However, his limitation to the slot and lack of athleticism makes me question how much of it he's truly capable of accomplishing in the NFL. Next, number 18, we have Ricky White, the third out of UNLV. He's listed on ESPN at 6'1", 190 pounds, and he'll be 23 years and 2 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt senior who started his career at Michigan State and then was suspended in 2021. He was suspended as part of a sexual assault investigation that, to be honest, seemed really messy when I was looking into it, so I don't want to discuss it too much in risk of giving inaccurate information. After being suspended for the 2021 season, White transferred to UNLV. For strengths, I was pretty impressed with White's ability to find open space against zone coverage. He typically did a good job adjusting the speed of his routes to either settle into a zone or wait for an opening to establish. He also did a good job working back to the quarterback in these areas to not only be in an opening, but also make himself an easier target. On that note of space, I think White also does a good job of having awareness of closing spaces. He knows when the area around him is closing and when he needs to secure a catch through contact, and also showed good control around the sidelines to finish tiptoe catches. White also doesn't have a lot of force missed tackles, but he is pretty twitchy, and that shows when he has the ball in his hands. He can make quick adjustments to make defenders miss and has fairly decent vision. He definitely has moments where he gets a bit too bounce happy and needs to calm down a bit, but overall he has some good potential with the ball in his hands. White's athleticism definitely shows more due to playing against lesser competition, but White is a good athlete with good speed and good twitch like I previously mentioned. He likely won't explode at the combine, but he has the speed, acceleration, and explosiveness to have a lot of potential as a route runner, and has the body control to make some impressive catches if paired with the right quarterback. For improvements, it's hard for me to confirm, but White seemed to run a pretty limited route tree comprised of straightforward offensive routes with a lot of slants, outs, hitches, and go routes. When he ran those and other routes, he was a bit sloppy in his cuts and would round them a bit too much while trying to rush through them. If he can prove that he has a diverse route tree and make more concise cuts, he could be a really interesting prospect. I also just haven't seen enough evidence to know for certain that White can routinely beat press. He played the majority of his snaps outside, but often got a free release either due to being played off the line of scrimmage or their defense not coming up to press him. He also just hasn't gone up against quality press since his time at Michigan State, so will likely need to prove that he can beat press if he's invited to the Senior Bowl. I would also like to see White catch the ball away from his body more frequently. He does a good job attacking the ball when it's at eye level or high up, but under that, it can get a bit inconsistent. Not a major knock for him, as his hands are still good and reliable, but just something he can work on. In conclusion, White has some big question marks between the off-field stuff and his lower level competition, but I think he could become an interesting project for a team. There's a fair amount of his game that reminds me of Jaylin Tolbert. Now, Tolbert hasn't been very productive so far in his career, but like White, is a project that a team has been willing to try to develop. So it'll be interesting if a team is willing to try to take a chance on White and try to develop him as well. Next, number 17, we have Deion Burks out of Oklahoma. He's listed on ESPN at 5'11", 195 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 3 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt sophomore who was at Purdue for the past 3 seasons, but transferred to Oklahoma for the 2024 season. For his strengths, Burks' athleticism is apparent anytime he has his hands on the ball. He runs with great speed and acceleration to get the defense on their heels. When he doesn't have the ball, his explosiveness and foot speed show in his cuts, and he can create some easy separation out of his breaks. I also like how Burks isn't afraid to go up and attack the ball away from his body. He attacks the ball with great timing and with late hands. He isn't always able to finish these catches reliably, which we'll get into later, but it's crucial that he does this with a smaller build to give himself a better opportunity to make plays at receiver. What also helps Burke attack the ball consistently is his strong ball tracking and adjustment skills. He does a great job following off-target balls and knows how to time his approach and contort his body to make a play on the ball even with his limited size. For improvements, Burks needs to work on maintaining his balance through routes. There are too many times when he would let the corner's press push him off his intended route path. Also, there were a number of times when he would run his route and run himself straight into a linebacker and either struggle to redirect his route or let them make contact and halter his route. Burke's difficulties with physicality also show in his struggles in contested catch situations. Throughout his career, he has only converted about 21.9% of his contested catch opportunities on 32 opportunities. His struggles in this area are due to his smaller build and just not being able to rise through contacts to finish catches. He also just needs to work on his hands in general. He had way too many drops last year with a drop rate of 14.5% per PFF, and there were also an issue in his only other non-redshirt year. He really needs to find a way to be a more consistent catcher, otherwise his upside won't amount to much in the NFL. I was also disappointed with Burks' yak ability. As I mentioned, he has the speed, acceleration, and explosiveness to be a great weapon in the open field, but didn't deliver on this when he did have openings and often settled for straight pass instead of being able to make defenders miss. Hopefully the change to Oklahoma will allow Burks to deliver more in this area. In conclusion, Burks has a lot of upside with his athleticism and with the way he attacks the ball, but the results just aren't always there right now. If he can get better balance and more consistent hands, he could have a chance to rise, especially if he can deliver with his athleticism with the ball in his hands more frequently. Next, number 16, we have Samuel Brown Jr. out of Miami. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 195 pounds, and he'll be about 23 years old on draft night in 2025 from what I could find. He's a redshirt senior who started out his career at West Virginia, then transferred to Houston for the 2022 season, and now transferred to Miami for the 2024 season. For strengths, Brown Jr. can make some really tough adjustments to balls and does a good job high-pointing them with his big frame to get there before the defender even has a chance to make a play on the ball. In the chances he was given, he seemed like a great 50-50 type of ball winner with a great eye to track the ball. Brown Jr. can also show that he has some really strong hands securing catches even when he had a defender all over him. He does have some issues with his hands that I'll get into later, but he has really reliable hands that mostly make the easy catches and more times than not come down with the tough catches through hits. I was also surprised to see the athleticism that Brown Jr. has. He has good speed and really solid explosiveness, and isn't the stiff athlete that you would expect from someone his size. He also showed some good vision with the ball in his hands and a good balance to help survive hits. For improvements, while Brown Jr.'s hands are really solid, he can be prone to some really frustrating concentration drops. Drops haven't been a major issue for him, and like I mentioned before, he has some good hands, so hopefully something he can finally clean up. Brown Jr.'s release can also be inconsistent. He does have good patience most times, but sometimes he runs into his corner and just expects to win with his size and strength, allowing the corner to slow him down. He needs to use more timing and pair it with explosiveness to win more consistently in his release to make his life a lot easier. I would also like to see Brown Jr. clean up his cuts in his routes. He rounds a lot of cuts and doesn't explode out of them. There were also a number of times when he was a bit sluggish getting into his break, and if he can get into his cuts quicker and make them more concise to have better angles to box out defenders, he can make himself a really easy target in short yardage situations. In conclusion, Brown Jr. is an interesting player who could be a riser if he gets some chemistry with Cam Ward at Miami this season. I think Coleman is a more talented player, but there are some similarities between Brown Jr. and Coleman, as both were transfer players with good size, jump ball ability, and athleticism, which let Coleman become a riser last season. Brown Jr. will be interesting to keep an eye on this coming season, and I wouldn't be surprised if he leads the Hurricanes in touchdown receptions this season. Next, number 15, we have Caden Prather out of Maryland. He's listed on ESPN as 6'3", 210 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 7 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a senior who started out his career at West Virginia, and then transferred to Maryland for the 2023 season. For strengths, Prather is really good at adjusting his body to make the most of his big frame. He can bend and contort to off-target throws and seem to have good foot awareness around the sidelines. His tendency to attack the ball away from his body also let him make a play on the ball before the defenders got a chance. Speaking of attacking the ball, I really liked how consistently Prather caught the ball away from his body and how often he got it at its highest point. With his size and long arms, that gave him an easy advantage against smaller corners and also gave him more time to turn and be ready to run downfield. Prather's ball tracking is also solid. He does a good job following the ball through defenders and making a play on the ball. There's definitely some times when he would lose track of the ball late, but I saw more good than bad in this area. For improvements, Prather has room to grow as a route runner. He has explosion in his cuts, but he can clean up his cuts and get a better understanding of how to use tempos and fakes. He runs his routes at one speed right now, and he has tried to use some head fakes, but they just aren't very effective right now. That being said, there are flashes when he showed promise of a solid route runner. Prather can also work to be more efficient in his release. In the snaps I saw when he won with his release, they were often slow developing. In other snaps, when he didn't win, he often tried to use fakes and jab steps and ended up just having wasted motion that the corner didn't bite on. These issues caused just too many inconsistencies in his ability to separate. Also, Prather can clean up his hands a little bit. He's capable of making some tough catches and does a good job finishing catches through hits, but his hand technique can be a bit inconsistent at times, which led to a few drops. Overall, it's not a major concern, but something he can work on in 2024 to be a more reliable receiver. In conclusion, Prather interests me. He seems like a player who knows what he needs to do, but isn't quite to the point of knowing how to do it just yet. With more time and potentially better coaching in the NFL, he could become a quality player for a team. Next, number 14, we have John Michael Sturdivant out of UCLA. He's listed on ESPN as 6'3", 205 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 7 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt junior who was at Cal for the first 2 seasons of his college career, then transferred to UCLA for the 2023 season. For strengths, Sturdivant struggled with drops in 2022, but really took it upon himself to clean up his hands. After having 11 drops on 102 targets in 2022, he had only 3 drops on his 70 targets in 2023. He catches the ball with good hand technique and typically does a good job catching the ball away from his body. Sturdivant's athleticism is also clear on all routes with great acceleration and the ability to eat a cushion almost instantly. He also does a good job stacking his defender and delivering often as a vertical weapon. He also has good explosiveness that shows in a lot of his cuts, which gives him some good potential to develop as a route runner. I was also pretty impressed with the way Sturdivant could adjust to off-target throws and back shoulder throws. He showed a good eye for the ball and wasn't afraid to attack the ball at its highest point with good hand technique to come down with some pretty impressive catches. He also showed good awareness around the sidelines to finish some tightrope catches. For improvements, Sturdivant really needs to improve as a route runner and especially needs to break down more frequently in his cuts. There were so many times that he made some cuts that were so rounded that it drifted him away from his quarterback and also made an easier angle for the cornerback to cover. He also didn't seem to run a diverse route tree, which makes me a little bit more nervous about his route running potential. That being said, he seems to do well against zone coverage and has a good eye for openings of where to settle. Also, Sturdivant didn't face press very often since teams were scared of his speed and his release isn't terrible, but he doesn't seem like he always has a plan to win and keep himself clean. Also, he often lets his corners push him off his route to a pretty far degree. Combining those two issues make it too easy for him to be slowed down and limit how much he can hurt a defense in the vertical game. Sturdivant also sold himself as a vertical threat due to having no tempo to his vertical routes. He makes it too easy for defenders to turn their hips and plan to run deep instead of keeping them on their toes and using his burst to beat them downfield. In conclusion, I definitely understand where a lot of his fans are coming from since the athleticism and talent are there. What Sturdivant needs to do, though, is deliver on his potential and become a more developed route runner, or just become an absolutely dominant vertical receiver to really move up in these rankings. Next, number 13, we have CJ Daniels out of LSU. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 200 pounds, and he'll be 23 years and 3 months old on draft night in 2025. I've seen some sites list him as a fifth-year senior and others that have him as a redshirt senior, and I'm counting him as a redshirt senior due to only playing 4 games in 2022 due to injuries. He played his first 4 seasons at Liberty but transferred to LSU for the 2024 season. For strengths, Daniels can make some really impressive catches to misplaced throws and back shoulder throws. He maximizes his lanky frame to snatch the ball at its highest point and gives himself a huge catch radius. He also has good foot awareness around the sidelines and great ball tracking skills to finish some really impressive catches fading away toward the sideline. These were some of the reasons he was able to put up double-digit touchdowns the past year and will likely do so again this coming season. On the note of making some impressive catches, Daniels is capable of doing this thanks to his strong hands. He's able to reel balls in with his fingertips and also has a lot of success holding onto balls through hits throughout his career. When he's focused and going for the catch, he's really impressive with the catches he can come down with. A lot of taller, lanky receivers often lack great burst and explosiveness, but I was really impressed with the explosion Daniels has. It shows in all of his leaps for catches, but also appears in his cuts and when he has the ball in his open field to add a bit more of an interesting upside to him. For improvements, while Daniels can make the really difficult catches, he can also drop the easy ones. There are too many times when he would take his eyes downfield to prepare for defenders and end up dropping the ball. Clearly he has great hands and can make the hard catches, so I want to see him finish the easy ones on a more consistent basis as well. Daniels will also need to learn to run his routes with more urgency and nuance. He can be a bit slow out of his breaks and doesn't use much of trickery in his routes with little to no head fakes and typically runs his routes at one speed. That can work in the Conference USA, but he'll need to do more if he wants to win routinely in the SEC. Part of the issue comes from his route running deficiencies and its inconsistent release, but Daniels will also need to prove that he can get consistent separation against better competition. His typical separation seemed a bit disappointing against lesser competition, and while he did have a good game against Oregon last season, I'm concerned he may struggle to be a consistent player this coming season if he can't get routine separation. In conclusion, there's a lot to like about CJ Daniels, and it'll be interesting to see how he holds up against SEC competition. I think if he does well, he will create a lot of buzz around him for the next draft cycle. Daniels really isn't to his level, but there is a lot about Daniels that reminds me of Javon Baker, who got a lot of fans this last draft cycle. I'm not sure if he will get close to Baker's level, but there is a lot to like and should be a fun player to monitor this coming season. Next, number 12, we have Tez Johnson out of Oregon. He's listed on ESPN at 5'10", 160 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 11 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a senior who was at Troy for the first 3 seasons of his career, then transferred to Oregon for the 2023 season. For his strengths, Johnson has great speed and acceleration who showed his athleticism on every single snap he played on the field. He has excellent acceleration with great stop and go ability and great straight line speed to easily outrun defenders. Also, Johnson is such a great weapon with the ball in his hands. He has great vision to follow his blocks and can even set up blocks downfield and can cruise through openings with his speed and acceleration. His explosiveness also shows in his cuts as he can completely juke out defenders in the open field. Johnson didn't have to rely on his ball tracking skills too much with his route tree, but when he did, he showed great concentration to follow the ball downfield and attack the ball in the air. He also showed the ability to finish catches over his shoulder, strengthening his vertical ability. For improvements, I would like to see Johnson catch the ball away from his body more consistently. He often allowed the ball to get to his body and trap it instead of attacking the ball. He didn't have a lot of opportunities for contested catch opportunities due to being open on a regular basis with the routes he ran, but his reliance on body catching combined with his smaller frame has led to some struggles finishing contested catches. Also, Johnson has great cuts and his explosiveness shows in his breaks on his routes, but he just had a really limited route tree last year. Also, he didn't run with much if any nuance in his routes with a lack of tempo and head fakes, and relied more on athleticism and scheme plays to get open. Also, I just can't ignore Johnson's frame at 5'10", 160 pounds. Now, he definitely has a lot more of his weight as muscle, but whenever I see a receiver or really any professional athlete who is similar in size and weight to me, that's just an immediate red flag for me. But in all seriousness, there just isn't a great track record for players with his weight and his lack of size who are capable of being consistent contributors in the NFL. His limited frame also gave him a lot of troubles in the few snaps against press, and he'll need to find a way to either expand his frame or beat press more reliably if he wants to be more than a slot receiver in the NFL. In conclusion, Johnson statistically was an amazing player last year, but one who has major concerns when looking at his frame and how he won. He definitely has upside thanks to his athleticism, but he needs to work on using the athleticism to refine his route running to be able to be the best version of himself at his limited size. Next, number 11, we have Torrey Horton out of Colorado State. He's listed on ESPN as 6'2", 190 pounds, and he'll be about 23 years old on draft night in 2025 from what I could find. He's a fifth-year senior who started out his career at Nevada, then transferred to Colorado State for the 2022 season. For strengths, Horton's at his best when he's able to fly down the field in a straight line. He's a long strider who eats up a cushion very quickly and can use some good tempo in his approach to create separation downfield. He can also use his speed to sell vertical routes and get easy separation on hitch routes, and he also does a good job stacking the corner to make an easier target for his quarterback. Horton also has great hands and routinely catches the ball away from his body with good hand technique. He also showed some really tough hands and great concentration to finish catches through contact, which helped him add more versatility by winning underneath this past season. He did have some really rough concentration drops against Boise State, but was otherwise really solid outside of that game and still made some really tough catches in that game. Horton wouldn't be a vertical specialist if he didn't have very good ball tracking skills. He routinely finishes catches over his shoulders and shows a lot of concentration while making catches to finish through contact. He was also able to use his ball tracking skills to make adjustments to misplaced throws to finish tough catches. For improvements, while Horton did show more versatility in his route tree and showed a good eye for openings against zone coverage, he still needs to improve his craft as a route runner. He rounds a lot of his cuts and sometimes drifts himself into coverage. He also did a better job working back to the quarterback, but sometimes does it to too high of a degree at times where he's sacrificing yards he could have gotten. There's also too many times when Horton would allow physical coverage to derail his path. Some of that comes down to his release against press, but he also had trouble playing through defenders when they would try to cut off his path and he would have a lot of difficulty staying on his feet when they would provide a bump during his route. Also, it's not Horton's fault, but he's had very few opportunities to play against serious competition while in college. In most of the few opportunities he's had, the games ended up as blowouts, which let him benefit from beating up on some backups in the games he stuck in for. That being said, he will have more opportunity to dispel this concern with some tough matchups this coming season. In conclusion, Horton intrigued me last year and showed more versatility this past season, which makes him even more interesting to me. I still want to see him continue to develop as a route runner, but the improvements he made from 2022 to 2023 are promising. There will, of course, remain the question of if he can succeed against better competition, and I'll be watching his matchups against Texas and Oregon State closely this season to see if he can replicate his success in those games. If he has strong games in those matchups and he gets an invite to the Senior Bowl and has a strong performance there, I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in most people's top 10 rankings at the position. Alright, finally getting to our top 10. At number 10, we have Evan Stewart out of Oregon. He's listed on ESPN as 6 foot, 175 pounds. He'll be 21 years and 7 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who's been at Texas A&M for his first 2 seasons and missed 3 games last season due to a leg injury and then transferred to Oregon for the 2024 season. For strength, Stewart is one of the best movers in this group. He has great speed, acceleration, and some of the best stop-start ability in this group. He can effortlessly change direction on a dime and can leave defenders in the dust. I like to see him use those skills a bit more in his route running nuance and in the open field, but it's hard to find someone that moves like him. I was also relatively impressed with Stewart's eye for open space against zone coverage. He seemed to have good peripheral vision to avoid contacts from linebackers and safeties ready to push him off his route, and also had a good understanding of when to settle into openings against their zone. Stewart did get to show it a lot since he ran a lot more slants than screens at Texas A&M, but when he got the ball in his hands, he showed good awareness of the blocks around him and did a good job navigating defenders to help increase the yards he could pick up with the ball in his hands. His yak numbers aren't overly impressive for someone as athletic as he is due to the high number of slants and deep shots, but his yak numbers could really take off this coming season at Oregon. For improvements, Stewart can attack the ball with inconsistent hands, leading to a fair number of drops for the number of targets that he's had, and he also has an over-reliance on body catches at times. Also, his suboptimal hand attacks of the ball also limited his ability to finish catches through contact. There are definitely flashes when Stewart pairs athleticism with his route running, but in general he tends to lack nuance in his route running tempo and cuts. It also seemed like he ran a somewhat limited route tree, which made him even more predictable for defenders. For someone with his speed and quickness, I would love to see him sell his vertical and use his stop-go ability way more frequently for some easy wins, and he needs to break down more consistently in his cuts to make them sharper. Finally, Stewart's frame is just pretty small, and it definitely shows in some games. He doesn't hold up well against hits, and that may have contributed to some of his injuries. Also, he can be redirected on his routes too easily, which affects his separation. His smaller frame also could have contributed to some of his difficulties finishing catches through contacts as well. In conclusion, Sarratt has a ton of potential to be even higher on this list, but his frame, hand technique, and lack of nuance makes me nervous having him higher. He certainly has the chance to blow up at Oregon this coming season, but I want to see a more complete receiver before trusting him. Right now, I think Zay Flowers is a good high-end projection for him with similar frames and movement skills. However, Stewart will need to use his stop-start ability and his route running like Flowers did for me to trust Stewart as much as I trusted Flowers as a prospect. Next, number 9, we have Jaden Higgins out of Iowa State. He's listed on ESPN at 6'4", 210 pounds, and he'll be about 22 years old on draft night in 2025 from what I could find. He's a senior who played his first 2 seasons at Eastern Kentucky, then transferred to Iowa State for the 2023 season. For strengths, Higgins is up there with some of the best hands in this class. In his college career, he had just 5 drops on 221 targets, and just 2 drops the past 2 seasons on 166 targets. Higgins catches the ball with great hand technique and has strong hands that are able to snatch the ball well away from his frame and secure catches through hits. He also catches the ball with late hands to give defenders little time to make a play on the ball. Higgins also looks really smooth in making adjustments to balls. He effortlessly can contort his body and showed good foot awareness around the sidelines. Also, as I mentioned, he does a good job attacking the ball at its highest point to make the most of his long frame and movement skills. His adjustment skills also translated both in his outside snaps around the sidelines and when making adjustments to catches in traffic in the middle of the field when running out of the slot. I was also impressed with Higgins' ability to find openings in zone coverage. A lot of bigger receivers, especially ones coming from the FCS, likely don't have a good understanding how to identify zone coverage and settle into openings. Higgins, however, showed good awareness even in his first start for Iowa State against Iowa, and does a good job settling in opening areas and having his long frame ready to make an easy target for his quarterback. His frame and awareness made him very effective on slant routes throughout the season last year. For improvements, I would like to see Higgins get more creative and use his long arms more in his release. He doesn't often attack his corner with much of a plan and typically resorts to a single jab fake, then tries to run around them, which often lets the corner get their hands on him to slow him down and decrease his separation. He has decent foot speed but isn't capable of winning in his release with his feet and will need to use his long arms more frequently to win in his release and create easier separation. Also, it's not a major weakness, but I'd also like to see Higgins grow more as a route runner to create more separation as well. He has some solid fundamentals like being capable of making sharp cuts and breaking down his cuts. The problem for him is his sharp cuts aren't often concise and have a lot of extra steps that erase the effectiveness of the cut being sharp, and he doesn't always explode out of his breaks. Also, he seemed to run a bit of a limited route tree and will need to show a more diverse route tree this coming season. It goes with some of the things I mentioned earlier, but I also have questions about Higgins' explosiveness. Like I mentioned, his explosiveness doesn't exactly jump out to me in his cuts, and while he had the ball in his hands, I was a bit concerned that he's more of a good straight line speed athlete, but not an overly explosive one. The issue is that if he isn't explosive enough, he could continue to struggle with separation in the NFL and could ultimately limit his ceiling. In conclusion, right now I like Higgins, and I think he could develop into a solid receiver for an NFL team. I see a high-end projection for him as someone like Devontae Parker, who I was a big fan of when he was coming out of the draft, and someone who has been a very reliable target and has some ability to play inside and outside. My biggest concern is that if Higgins doesn't improve his release and route running, that we could have another bigger body receiver with good potential, but struggles to separate at the NFL level, which makes him more of a replacement level player. Next, number 8, we have Elijah Badger out of Florida. He's listed on ESPN as 6'2", 190 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 8 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a redshirt senior who played his first 4 seasons at Arizona State and then transferred to Florida for the 2024 season. For strengths, Badger's release stood out to me last summer, and though he played a bit more from the slot this last season, he still has really strong release skills. He's a twitchy athlete who has good timing and fakes to be able to get defenders to bite and then beat them deep. His A-dot dropped this past season, but it was not due to him struggling to create separation. Badger didn't have bad hands last year, but he did have some inconsistent hand technique leading to a few drops. This year he took it upon himself to improve in this aspect and really cleaned up his hands, leading to only 2 drops on 99 targets. He also showed good ball tracking skills and the ability to finish catches over his shoulder and seemed to do a better job attacking the ball in the air this year. I was also impressed with the way he knew how to use his body to box out the defenders to be able to secure the catch. Badger isn't the most dominant athlete and doesn't have the frame of Bulldogs players, but he does have good balance and very good quickness to juke out defenders. He can also be really slippery to make the players miss in the open field, which showed by him having the 7th most forced missed tackles in the country last season. He also has solid speed and showed good vision to pick up yards on a routine basis and make the most of his opportunities. For improvements, in 2022, Badger ran a fairly diverse route tree, but it seemed that got simplified to compensate for the quarterback play at Arizona State last year. I still think he's a capable route runner, but I'd like to see him expand the route tree again at Florida and not have this be stagnant or regress again. Also, he has a tendency to rush his cuts and round them a bit too much, so I'd like to see him clean that up as well this coming season. Also, I attribute it more to the poor offense as well, since it wasn't much of an issue in 2022, but Badger had a very high amount of quick, short design throws where he didn't have to work much to get open, with 58% of his receptions being behind the line of scrimmage and a very high mark of 83% of his receptions being less than 10 yards from the line of scrimmage last season. As I mentioned, this was less of an issue in 2022 with only 17% of his receptions being behind the line of scrimmage and 60% being less than 10 yards from the line of scrimmage, so I'm hoping his numbers at Florida will be closer to his 2022 year. Also, it didn't hold him back too much in the Pac-12, but Badger does have a very lean frame. It showed the most in his coverage, as some more physical defenders were able to push him off his route path, elongating his route, and sometimes taking him away as an option. His release helps him stay clean most times, but he'll need to use his balance as a yak player, as a route runner as well, to reach his ceiling. In conclusion, Badger had a down year statistically, but it was due to poor quarterback play and injuries at the position, with Arizona State finishing 86th in the country in passing yards per game, with only 208 yards per game and 8 total passing touchdowns last season. Honestly, it's impressive Badger is even able to put up the numbers he did in that offense. After having to watch that offense again last season, it made me happy to see him transfer out for better opportunities. I could see Badger coming out of nowhere next season due to the poor statistical season last year, and really make a name for himself by taking over Ricky Pearsall's role at Florida. If he's able to make a quick connection with Graham Mertz, he could become a big-time riser. Next, number 7, we have Isaiah Bond out of Texas. He's listed on ESPN at 5'11", 182 pounds, and he'll be 21 years and 1 month old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who was at Alabama the past 2 seasons, but transferred to Texas with the departures of Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell. For his strengths, Bond is an elite athlete with excellent speed and acceleration, and I don't think it's a stretch to assume that Bond will likely be the fastest player at the Combine next year. He also isn't afraid to take hits and lower his pads to try to stay up and survive hits. I was also very impressed with Bond's hands. He catches the ball with good hand technique and excellent concentration to finish tough catches. He also brings some really nice ability to adjust to the ball and finish balls around the sidelines. Bond also brings great ball tracking skills and is routinely able to finish catches over his shoulders. As a likely vertical weapon, ball tracking is potentially the second most valuable tool after elite speed, so his combination with both makes him a dangerous weapon with a quarterback who can accurately get the ball downfield. For improvements, I would like to see Bond run cleaner routes, but also to run with more balance in his routes. Bond ran a high number of vertical, post, hitch, and short pattern routes to maximize his speed, but he often relied on his speed in those routes and didn't run with clean cuts or good tempo. This allowed defenders to run at full speed with little thought needed to be prepared for any slowing up and adjustments they would need to take to keep up with him. Bond also struggled with physical coverage, being pushed off his spot a few times due to his smaller frame. He also seemed a bit slow at times getting his head turned around to the quarterback and didn't always do a good job establishing leverage against his defender. Bond just also had struggles with getting clean releases on a consistent basis. He often struggled with the strength of bigger cornerbacks and could sometimes have a hard time shaking them. Right now, he's mostly depending on his size and quickness to get out to a fast start to his route, but he needs to pair this with deception to really have consistent results. I also just really want to see Bond have better eye for zone coverage. There are so many times when he would find himself open against zone coverage, signal for the ball because he's open, but then continue his path and just put himself back into coverage with the defender he missed. He needs to work on having that awareness and peripheral vision to identify where defenders are and when and where to settle against zones. In conclusion, Bond has elite speed that will get him attention. I wasn't a big fan of Henry Ruggs as a player when he was coming out of school, but Bond reminds me a lot of Ruggs with their athleticism to win downfield despite smaller frames. Right now, though, those that have Bond higher are likely betting on his upside with his speed. but I just need to see more of a route runner and maybe see him have more weight or at least more balance to his routes to be more of a believer. Next, number 6, we have Jalen Royals out of Utah State. He's listed on ESPN as 6 foot, 195 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 2 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a senior who played his first 2 seasons at Georgia Military College, then transferred to Utah State for the 2023 season. For strengths, I was impressed with the cleanness and conciseness that Royals had while running his routes. I wasn't certain if he ran a diverse route tree, but the routes that he did run were extremely impressive with good cuts, tempo, and an understanding of how to work his leverage to get himself open. Also, Royals might have the strongest and toughest hands out of this entire group. He had a 73.9% success rate in contested catches last season, which is one of the highest marks I've seen for a while with the volume that he had. He's just so good at working back to his quarterback, attacking the ball at his highest point, and snatching it with good hand technique. Also, Royals didn't always have the opportunity to show it, but he has been clocked in at running a low 4.3 40 and also had explosive jumping numbers. The athleticism showed in his explosiveness in his cuts and ball attacks and the opportunities and as well as the opportunities he had when he got open space in front of him to turn on the jets. He also has great core strength to make tough adjustments to balls and make tight catches along the sidelines while keeping his feet in. For improvements, as I mentioned, Royals makes some really tough catches through contact and has clamps for hands. Unfortunately, he also has concentration drops like CJ Daniels that can be really disappointing, especially when they come right after a great catch. Like Daniels, I think he can clean up those drops, but he'll need to stay focused. As Royals is, I was a bit disappointed with his lack of creativity and ability to manufacture yards in the open field. His speed shows when he's running with the ball, but I'd like to see him use his explosiveness to make defenders miss and pick up more chunk yards in the open field. Also, like Torrey Horton, Royals is unfortunately a victim of playing against lesser opponents. He did well in his games against better competition, so I'm willing to trust him and have him this high, but he'll need to continue to play well in his higher level matchups this coming season. In conclusion, Royals might be one of my favorite sleepers in this group. He has excellent hands, a very solid foundation, and exciting athleticism. A lot of his areas of improvement could easily be non-issues this coming season and going forward. There's honestly a lot that reminds me of Jayden Reed when I was watching him, and I think Royals could see a sudden rise leading up to the draft if he puts up another strong year and a strong Senior Bowl like Reed did. Next, number 5, we have Travis Hunter out of Colorado. He's listed on ESPN as 6'1", 185 pounds, and he'll be 21 years and 11 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who played his freshman year at Jacksonville State, then transferred to Colorado with Deion Sanders. At both schools, he famously, or potentially infamously, has been playing both receiver and corner in games. For strength, Hunter has fantastic hands that shine on both offense and defense. On defense, he showed great ball skills to attack the ball better than some receivers and made effortless catches away from his frames. On offense, he has the same mentality with great hand technique leading to no drops and 73 targets. I was also surprised by how strong his hands were to finish catches through hits despite his smaller frame and practically playing the entire game. Also, it shouldn't be surprising with Hunter being asked to play on both sides of the ball, but he's a great athlete with excellent acceleration, fluid movement, and great speed. His athleticism was apparent on every play, whether it was on offense or defense, and despite playing on both sides of the ball, he's great at making defenders miss in the open field. On rewatch, I was also extremely impressed with Hunter's release skills. He primarily played out of the slot, but when he was on the outside, he had a variety of moves that he paired well with his athleticism to beat defenders and use his long arms to create separation downfield. Some of the areas I'm going to touch on for his areas of improvement may make it seem like he's limited to a role in the slot, but he has the size and release skills to make it as an outside receiver if asked to. For improvements, it's hard because I think the biggest issue is Hunter just not having enough time to focus at receiver, but I'd like to see him run a more diverse route tree. A lot of his passes were simple, short concepts with an emphasis to get him the ball in space and give him an opportunity to get yards after the catch or get open quickly against off coverage. And I don't know if we'll ever get a chance to see a more expansive route tree with his two-way playing, but it would really help his projection as a receiver. Also, this also can't really be blamed on him since he's playing nearly every single snap of every game, but his route effort can be on and off. When a plane is drawn up to him and to his side, he's full throttle. When it's not, there are times when he seems a bit checked out and likely catching his breath. Again, I don't blame him, and it would be absurd for me to question a player's effort when he plays full-time on both sides of the ball. But it's just an unfortunate issue since he doesn't have the chance to catch his breath on defense, and unfortunately has to do so on the offensive side of the ball. I also never thought I would have to have usage as an issue for a receiver, but I also never thought that we would have a player that played on both sides of the ball as frequently as Hunter in today's college football. This would be an issue on any team, but due to the high number of snaps, but is especially an issue for him at Colorado, which ranked 19th in college football with 74 snaps per game last season. That's also with their rate going down pretty significantly at the end of the year, so it was pretty crazy at the beginning when it was, I believe, around in the 80s or higher for the first half of the year. That's just so many snaps and just opens the door for too much injury for a sport that already has a high rate of injury. In conclusion, Hunter is an extremely talented and exciting player, but I'm worried about him. I think he should absolutely go in the first round of the NFL draft, but I have serious concerns about injuries popping up for him if he continues to play on both sides of the ball. I have to give him credit for wanting to play that much, but just as players skip bowl games and some players even skip seasons to protect themselves in their draft outlook, Hunter needs to protect himself as well. I personally view him to be better at corner and likely a better fit there long term, but the contracts receivers are getting and the longevity of the position, I think he'll ultimately decide to go to receiver in the NFL. If I'm correct, I think a team will be getting a very exciting project that should continue to develop and more time being able to focus on a single position. Next, number 4, we have Alec Ayomanor out of Stanford. He's listed on ESPN at 6'2", 210 pounds, and he'll be about 21 years old on draft night in 2025 from what I could find. He's a redshirt sophomore who tore his ACL, MCL, meniscus in 2022, causing him to miss his entire freshman season, but returned for 2023 for his first season of college football. For strengths, I was incredibly impressed with Ayomanor's release skills despite this essentially being his first season in college football. He can win a number of different ways and has really great timing to his movements that helped him win with his release, even when he didn't have full confidence in his knee for the first part of the year. Ayomanor's route running was also incredibly impressive given his lack of experience. He ran a variety of different routes and ran his routes with crisp and nice nuance, with head fakes and tempo that made him really difficult to keep up with once his knee felt close to back to normal. Like his game against Colorado was just him running a clinic of how to open corners hips up to the outside, then break inside for easy separation on a slat route. Also, he has a veteran eye for opening against zone and doesn't put himself back into coverage after beating the initial coverage in his release and break. Ayomanor also showed great ball tracking skills to follow deep balls and could finish catches while attacking the ball in the air. There were definitely times when he would lose the ball, but in general this seemed to be a strength of his, and his misses seemed more due to getting acclimated in his first season. For improvements, while Ayomanor can make some incredible catches, including his catch on Travis Hunter, he can also have some lapses in concentration, leading to some disappointing drops. Some of this was due to a few times when his hands would be a little bit too slow to attack the ball, and sometimes he could also attack the ball with some suboptimal hand technique. Also, he can work to do a better job using his big frame to box out defenders and finish catches in traffic. These are all things, though, that I think he could easily work out of his games due to how he finished some really tough catches throughout the season. Also, I'm sure his knee injury played a role in this, but while his cuts created separation thanks to his fakes and timing, he didn't blow out of his cuts like some of the top tier athletes at the position. Again, this could be a non-issue this coming season with another year removed from his injury, but it will be something that I'll be keeping an eye on this coming season. Speaking of Ayomanor's knee injury, it will be something that will be interesting to see what NFL teams' medical staffs think of it. As I mentioned, he tore his ACL, MCL, and meniscus in 2022, and while he looked comfortable this last season, it's a pretty significant injury that NFL teams aren't going to overlook during the draft cycle. In conclusion, if there might be a fan club for Ayomanor already, but if there isn't, I'm ready to be the president. The year he had in his first year of college football and coming off of a major knee injury is just incredible. He has most of the traits you want from an outside receiver with great speed, size, release package, and route running. It's a very lofty projection, but there is a lot of his game that reminds me of Amari Cooper. Now we'll see what 2024 brings and if he can get even close to that type of projection, but if he can clean up his hands and his explosiveness comes back, I think he could push himself even a bit higher in these rankings by the end of the season and come closer to that higher end projection. Next at number 3, we have Emeka Egbuka out of Ohio State. He's listed on ESPN at 6'1", 206 pounds, and he'll be 22 years and 4 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a senior who had a strong 2022 season, but struggled with an ankle injury throughout the 2023 season that eventually needed tightrope surgery. For strengths, throughout his career, Egbuka was solid in yak situations thanks to his athleticism, but he seemed to take another step forward in this area with improved contact balance that actually allowed him to have more forced missed tackles in 2023 than in 2022 despite fewer played games and an injury-riddled season. I was trying to find out if he actually put on weight and couldn't find anything to confirm this, but he just really seemed to hold up stronger against hits, despite what his unlucky injuries suggest. He didn't quite look the same in 2023 with his injuries, but Egbuka is a very good route runner with nice cuts and good tempos to his routes to create easy separation when paired with his athleticism. He also still has a good eye for opening against zone coverage, which will be incredibly important if he continues to primarily play out of the slot. I did feel like he still primarily ran shorter routes and would like to see him expand to deeper concepts more regularly, but I think the failure of Kyle McCord and Egbuka's injuries played a role in that usage this past year. Egbuka also has great hands and does a good job consistently attacking the ball with good hand technique. Last summer I noticed some concentration drops, but he did a better job cleaning that up in his limited 2023 season. For improvements, I know this in 2022, and his injuries didn't do him any favors in 2023, but Egbuka still has some struggles separating vertically against defenders. It still seems like a fair amount of his struggles comes with his release, since he has the athleticism to beat defenders vertically. He just needs to continue to work on this to prove he is a versatile receiver. Another thing that I think causes Egbuka trouble as a deep route runner is some struggles against physical coverage. At times he would allow defenders to get their hands on him to slow him down, and not have swats that were strong enough or well aimed enough to be able to help separate. This is something that I'm hoping he can develop more, but will likely need more snaps outside to get more live practice. Also, it's hard to know for certain if this is due to necessity based on his skills, or just circumstance, but Egbuka has slightly over 2/3 of his career snaps coming out of the slot, and will likely continue to be a primarily slot receiver in the NFL. Again, with modern offenses, this isn't as much of an issue, but some teams may still prefer players that are primarily outside receivers. Now, with the departure of Marvin Harrison Jr., Ohio State's receiving room is pretty unproven outside of Egbuka, so he might get a chance to show some more versatility on the outside this coming season. In conclusion, I don't think it's unreasonable to mostly ignore the 2023 season for Egbuka. I still have concerns if he's truly capable of being a receiver 1 for a team, but he still seems like a player with a very high floor and is fully capable of being a strong receiver 2 for any team. If he does get that opportunity to play outside more, he could answer a lot of questions that he has and Jackson Smith and Jigba had when he was coming out. That being said, I think the biggest thing for him will be to stay healthy this coming season. If he's healthy and replicates his 2022 year, I don't think too many teams will be too concerned about trusting him as one of their top receivers. Next, number 2, we have Tetairoa McMillan out of Arizona. He's listed on ESPN at 6'5", 210 pounds, and he'll be 22 years old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who's been at Arizona for the past 2 seasons. For his strengths, McMillan displays great body control on nearly every reception. He can rise up for balls, he can adjust to poorly placed throws, and he can keep his feet in bounds around the sidelines. All these traits combined with his huge height make him an extremely dangerous weapon, especially around the red zone. McMillan also has really great ball skills to allow him to finish catches after making tough adjustments. He consistently catches the ball with good hand technique away from his body, and very rarely drops the ball, that as you can see with just having 2 drops on 130 targets this past season. He also has strong hands to finish catches while taking hits. A lot of receivers McMillan's size are slower and have to rely on their size. McMillan, though, is a smooth athlete with good speed and nice acceleration and foot speed to sometimes make defenders miss in the open field. He also even showed good vision to follow blocks and screenplays, which adds a nice wrinkle to his game. For improvements, McMillan rounds a ton of his cuts to the point that some cuts he doesn't even attempt to make them sharp. He has shown he is capable of making sharp cuts, but often settles on rounded cuts when the defense plays off and he knows that he can get open. I would like to see him make more consistently sharp cuts to create easier and more consistent separation for himself. Also, I kind of mentioned this back in my quarterback rankings with Noel Fifita, but Arizona's offense was a bit basic in the first half of the year, which caused McMillan to have a pretty limited route tree. As the offense expanded as the year went on, McMillan got more involved down the field, but still ran what seemed to be a limited route tree. So I'll be curious to see what type of routes they have him run now that Fifita has more experience. I also just have to point out McMillan's size. Being 6'5" is great, but being that height at only 210 pounds makes him a bit of an outlier. That being said, every year we see colleges fudge measurement numbers, and I'd be surprised if McMillan is a true 6'5". He looks more like 6'3", maybe 6'3.5" at most to me, and if he's around that height, then that brings his proportions to essentially the same as Marvin Harrison Jr. and Brian Thomas Jr. from last year, and makes the measurements less of an outlier and less of a concern. In conclusion, McMillan is extremely talented, and I truly think he has a legitimate case of being the receiver 1 in this class and could end up there at the end of the season. What he'll need to do to prove that he can be the receiver 1 is clean up his cuts and prove he can handle a more diverse route tree. If he does that, the sky may be the limit for him. Finally, at number 1, we have Luther Burn III out of Missouri. He's listed on ESPN at 5'11", 208 pounds, and he'll be 21 years and 4 months old on draft night in 2025. He's a junior who's been at Missouri for the past 2 seasons. For strengths, Burton's a great athlete in nearly every way. He has great speed and acceleration, which help him beat defenders in his routes and after the catch. His agility and foot speed is also apparent in his routes, with the ability to make snappy cuts before the defender has a chance to react. He also has nice balance and strength to maintain his balance through hits and pick up extra yards. Also, Burton has great ball tracking skills and is able to follow the ball through defenders' arms and through contact to make tough catches. He also showed the ability to finish catches over his shoulders, and is also able to adjust to poorly placed balls and still make a play on them to give him a good chance of securing the catch. All this makes him one of the most QB-friendly targets in the class despite his height. Despite Burton's high yards after the catch numbers, it wasn't due to primarily running short patterns. Burton has a very diverse route tree that used him at all levels of the field despite primarily playing out of the slot. That type of diversity should give anyone some cover in case they're concerned if he can handle all the routes asked of an outside receiver. For improvements, I would like to see Burton have more nuance to his routes. A lot of his routes, he often rushes through things and tries to rely on his athleticism. When he's the better athlete, it works out, and even when he isn't, he can still often make a play on the ball. However, a lot of times he keys defenders into the path of his routes with minimal or suboptimal fakes and often lacks tempo to his routes. I'm hoping another year of experience and more coaching will add this aspect to his game. Also, Burton sometimes will cheat on his cuts and round them to try to speed them up. Right now he's still trying to rely too much on his athleticism to make speedy movements, but if he combines his quickness with sharp cuts on a more consistent basis, he'll be deadly. With Burton primarily playing from the slot this past year, he didn't have a lot of exposure to press, so this will likely be a question for NFL teams. For the snaps I saw against press, it seems like he's capable of handling it and did primarily play out wide during his freshman year, so I'm not overly concerned about it, but it will likely be a point people will bring up during the draft cycle if he continues to primarily play out of the slot this coming season. Personally, I get why people want a receiver playing out wide, but with modern day offenses and a number of receivers that thrive in the slot, it's not a major concern for me, even if he did struggle with press. In conclusion, Burton lives up to the hype and will be one of the most coveted players in the 2025 class. His combination of athleticism, ball skills, and route running potential has the makings of being the receiver 1 of this upcoming class. If he learns the nuances of route running, he'll be capable of being a major contributor for an NFL team on day 1. And that concludes the receivers. This class is definitely a step down from last year heading into the season, but has a lot of receivers who could really rise and impress this season. Right now, I see Brennan and McMillan as clear first-round talents. After them, Egbuka could get there, especially if he has a good season and tests well. Ayo Manor might be one of my favorite dark horse players to sneak into the first round next year. With his size, speed, and route running, I could see a lot of people and teams falling for him as they did for Brian Thomas Jr. in this last class. It might be a controversial opinion, but I personally don't see Travis Hunter as a first-round receiver right now, though I would have him as a first-round cornerback. But he has a lot of potential if he focuses on one position. After those guys, though, I think it gets dicey with a lot of guys who need improvements in key areas, and rankings will likely be dependent on what people look for in their receivers. With receiver rankings always being all over the place right now, I'm sure everyone's rankings will be different, so let me know if there's any players you think I have too high or too low. Also, let me know if there's any players you think I missed that I should check out. You can let me know by commenting below or on Twitter or X and Reddit at Backseat Scout. Also, to plug a site I'm a contributor for again, you can check out Fantasy Trading Room if you want to check out any of my other work there. Next week we'll be in the home stretch and finish out my summer scouting series with tight ends. I won't be going through as many, so I should be set to be able to have it out as scheduled, and then we'll likely go to more normal length content for a while. If you want to make sure you don't miss the tight ends and the rest of my content after, be sure to subscribe. And while you're at it, like the video as it would mean a lot and help the channel continue to grow thanks to you. Thank you all and see you all next time.